The witch's forbidden air. The sky was a tapestry of soft oranges and purples, the sea lapping gently against the craggy shoreline as the waves whispered their secrets to the wind. The lone cottage stood defiantly against time and tide, an eternal sentinel on the northern cliffs. Inside, a woman, fierce and formidable, watched the horizon, her green eyes gleaming like emeralds against the firelight. She was Seraphina, once a court enchantress, a heroine and the secret lover of King Aldric. Years ago she had stood within the marble halls of the palace, heart thrumming with devotion and magic alike. She had loved the king beyond reason, and he had loved her in return. They had shared stolen moments beneath moonlit arches, whispered dreams of a future that could never be. But duty had a cruel hand, and Aldric had been bound to marry Princess Alara to secure a political alliance. When he told her of his impending marriage, Seraphina had begged him to defy the council, to choose love over duty. Yet he had turned away, his face shadowed with regret, whispering, "I cannot." Fury and heartbreak warred within her. "You would cast me aside like a common mistress?" She had spat, her emerald eyes blazing with sorrow. "After all we have shared? After all we have built together?" "I would never cast you aside," he had whispered, stepping toward her, his hands trembling. "But I am a king before I am a man. I do this for the kingdom." Tears had burned in her eyes, but she had steeled herself. "Then you have made your choice, and so will I." With those words, she had turned her back on him and walked away, not allowing herself to see the torment in his eyes. Her heart ached, but she knew she could not stay where she was not wanted, where duty and politics dictated her worth. She left the palace that very night, her belongings packed hastily as she fled under the cover of darkness. The journey to the northern cliffs was treacherous, but she pressed on, determined to find solace away from the cruel machinations of the court. The sea with its endless horizon became her refuge, the crash of waves against the rocks a soothing balm to her shattered heart. It was weeks later, as she was settling into her new life in the lonely cottage, that she realized something was amiss. The fatigue, the nausea, the way her magic thrummed differently within her, it all led to one undeniable truth. She was carrying Aldric's child. Shock and despair consumed her. The realization brought fresh agony, reopening the wounds she had worked so hard to heal. He had chosen his kingdom over her, over their love, and now she bore the proof of their bond alone. But as the initial grief faded, something new took root within her, a fierce determination. This child was hers, and she would raise him far from the treacherous hands of the court. He would never be a pawn in their games, never be used as a tool for power. She would teach him strength, wisdom, and above all, freedom. The years passed, and whispers of the sea witch spread through the kingdom. The king always kept his ear to the villages, prying for information about Seraphina. Though she remained secluded, the villagers had caught glimpses of a boy growing under her care. Rumors soon reached Aldric. The child was his. When Lucian was 4 years old, the king's resolve hardened. He needed an heir, and with no children from his queen, he sought to claim his son. He sent an army to take the boy, but they never returned. The night the soldiers marched into the northern cliffs, the sky darkened with an unnatural storm. The waves raged against the rocks, and the air crackled with untamed magic. Seraphina met them at the edge of her land, her emerald eyes burning with fury. She raised her hands, whispering words of ancient power, and the very earth trembled. The soldiers were swallowed by the mist, their screams lost to the roaring wind. None survived. From that night onward, none dared to set foot near her home. The villagers, in hushed voices, spoke of the sea witch who had defied a king and shattered his men with nothing but her will. Meanwhile, Lucian grew restless. From an early age, he was strong, skilled, and fiercely intelligent, but also deeply curious about the world beyond the cliffs. His mother had always been strict, forbidding him from venturing too far from the cottage. Whenever he tried to sneak away toward the village, she would catch him, her emerald eyes blazing with anger and fear. He never understood why she punished him so harshly for something so simple as wanting to see more, to experience life beyond the endless waves and whispering winds. As the years passed, his longing only grew. He trained harder, his swordsmanship honed to perfection, his body strong and agile, but the emptiness in his heart remained. Why was he forced to live in isolation when others lived freely? He loved his mother, but he resented her secrecy, the way she always seemed to look past him when he asked about his father or why they had to live so far away. By the time he reached his 18th year, the restlessness had turned into an undeniable hunger. He wanted to see, to feel, to know what lay beyond the northern cliffs. So, one evening, under the guise of gathering supplies, he slipped away into the village. The town was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The streets were alive with the sounds of merchants bartering, the laughter of children playing, and the scent of roasted meat filling the air. It was exhilarating, but what drew him most was the warm glow of a tavern nestled between two stone buildings, a place where men gathered to drink and spin tales. Stepping inside, Lucian took in the sight of burly fishermen laughing over their mugs, traders swapping stories of lands far beyond the kingdom's borders, and weary travelers finding solace in the dim candlelight. It was there he first tasted the life beyond his mother's protection. "So where you from, young man?" the bartender, a grizzled old man with a scarred cheek, asked as he slid a mug of ale toward Lucian. "To the north by the sea." The tavern fell silent. The old man chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "That's a good joke, lad. The only building there is that old cottage. They say some heroine gave birth to an illegitimate heir there, and kills any man or beast what walks within a mile of the place. Killed the king's army, they say." Lucian frowned. "A heroine?" The bartender leaned closer. "Aye, a witch. King Aldric's woman once. He loved her, or so they say, but married a princess instead. When she bore his son, they wanted the boy. Needed him, in fact. The queen couldn't bear children. But the witch refused, so the king sent men to take him by force, and she destroyed them all." Lucian's breath caught in his throat. "You mean—" The bartender gave him a knowing look. "Aye, lad, the boy is the prince, the rightful heir to the throne." A rush of emotions surged through Lucian. Pride, anger, confusion. All his life his mother had protected him, but she had also kept the truth from him. He was more than a warrior. He was born to rule. That night, Lucian returned to the cottage, his mind ablaze with revelation. "You lied to me," he accused as Seraphina stood by the hearth, her gaze calm but unreadable. "I protected you," she corrected, folding her arms, though her voice carried a weariness she had long tried to suppress. This was the moment she had spent years trying to avoid, the confrontation she had always known would come. She had built their lives around secrecy, kept him sheltered, hoping he would never have to bear the weight of his lineage. Yet here he was, standing before her, questioning the very choices she had made to keep him safe. Her heart clenched. She had known the truth would hurt him, but she had convinced herself that as long as he remained hidden, he would be free. Now, looking into his stormy gaze, she wondered if she had only been postponing the inevitable. "The throne is a viper's nest, Lucian," she continued, the sorrow barely masked beneath her hardened exterior. "They wanted you only because they were desperate." Lucian's jaw tightened. "I have a right to my own destiny." Seraphina sighed, stepping toward him. "And what will you do with it? Fight for a throne that is poisoned with greed, or forge your own path?" Lucian hesitated. He had never desired power, but now that he knew who he was, could he simply walk away from it? Lucian could not rest after learning the truth of his lineage. As he sat by the fire that night, staring into the flickering flames, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. He had spent his entire life believing he was just a boy raised in isolation, unaware of the bloodline that ran through his veins. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind. The throne is a viper's nest. She had kept him hidden for a reason, and he had seen the depth of her power when she annihilated the king's army. But had she been right to keep this from him, Or had she only delayed the inevitable? His fingers curled into fists as another thought surfaced. What if he was meant for more? The people suffered, the kingdom crumbled, and there he was, the rightful heir, raised in strength and wisdom by the most formidable woman he knew. Could he really turn his back on them? His heart wavered between his mother's warnings and his own sense of duty. But deep down he knew. He could not ignore this. He had to see it for himself. He had to decide his own fate. Determined to see the kingdom for himself, he set out on a journey through its lands, disguising himself among the common folk. What he saw shook him to his core. The once prosperous kingdom was now crumbling, its streets lined with beggars, its markets empty. The people whispered of the king's failing health, his body weak and his mind distant. The queen had long since retreated into silence, while the nobles squandered what remained of the wealth. Lucian used the skills his mother had taught him to move unseen, to listen in the shadows. What he uncovered sent a chill through his veins. His father's distant cousin, Lord Cedric, lurked in the background, seizing control bit by bit. He sowed dissent among the lords, bribed the guards, and whispered treasonous words behind closed doors. The king, already weakened, was powerless against the growing corruption within his own court. After weeks of traveling, Lucian returned home, his heart heavy with what he had seen. Yet, amid the despair and ruin, he had found an unexpected light. In a small village on the kingdom's outskirts, he had met a young woman named Evelyn, a healer who tended to the sick and wounded despite having so little herself. She was kind, fiercely intelligent, and unshaken by hardship. Their first meeting had been under dire circumstances. Lucian had witnessed a group of soldiers harassing an elderly villager, demanding more taxes than he could afford. Before Lucian could intervene, Evelyn had stepped in, boldly defying the soldiers with nothing but her unwavering gaze and a sharp tongue. When the soldiers had raised their hands against her, Lucian had stepped forward, his presence alone enough to send them retreating. From that moment they had been drawn to one another. Evelyn introduced him to the struggles of the common people, showing him the suffering that had been ignored by the ruling class. Lucian spent days working alongside her, tending to the sick, protecting the vulnerable, and learning more about the people he was meant to rule. With every passing day, his admiration for her grew, and soon admiration turned to something deeper. On the night before he left under the glow of the moon, he had taken her hands in his own, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. "I have to go," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "There is something I must do." Evelyn's eyes searched his face, understanding but unwilling to let go so easily. "And when will you return?" she whispered. Lucian exhaled slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I swear to you, Evelyn, I will come back. No matter what happens, I will return for you." She smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. "Then go, my warrior, but do not make me wait too long." With one last lingering look, he turned and walked away, his heart aching with every step. He had made a promise, and Lucian did not intend to break it. Now standing before his mother, his hands clenched into fists, he could not shake the weight of what he had seen. "They cannot even rule," he said bitterly. "The kingdom is a mess. The people are starving, the nobility is corrupt, and, worse still, there is a tyrant waiting to seize power. I cannot ignore this." Seraphina regarded him for a long moment, sadness flickering in her eyes. "The world of men is cruel, Lucian. It devours the righteous and rewards the wicked. Are you certain you wish to walk this path?" Before he could answer, a rider arrived in the dead of night, breathless and weary. The king was dead. The queen had vanished, and Cedric had declared himself the new ruler. Lucian felt the weight of fate settle upon his shoulders. He could no longer stand by. He was the rightful heir, the son of a great sorceress, and a king who had loved her against all odds. He would claim his birthright not for power, but to restore justice. With his mother's reluctant blessing, he rode for the capital, the storm of destiny gathering at his back. Disguised as common travelers, Lucian and Seraphina entered the palace gates, blending seamlessly with the influx of visitors paying their respects to the late king. They moved through the grand halls, their presence unnoticed until they reached the throne room. Lord Cedric lounged upon the high seat, his expression one of smug satisfaction. The moment Lucian stepped forward, revealing himself, the usurper's face twisted in rage and fear. "You dare to stand before me?" Cedric sneered. "Guards, seize them." The guards rushed forward, their weapons drawn, their shouts echoing through the vast chamber. Lucian tensed, ready to fight. But before he could lift his sword, his mother raised her hands. A storm of energy erupted from her fingertips, the very air crackling with raw power. The torches flickered wildly as a violent wind surged through the room, lifting the soldiers off their feet as though they were weightless. They were hurled backward with tremendous force, their bodies slamming against the stone walls, armor clanging as they collapsed into unconscious heaps. A terrified hush fell over the court. The nobles who had once whispered of Seraphina's wrath in fearful secrecy now beheld it firsthand. The very foundations of the palace seemed to tremble in her presence. Seraphina's emerald eyes gleamed with an otherworldly fire as she stepped forward, her cloak billowing behind her like the wings of an avenging spirit. Cedric's face twisted in horror. "Witch!" he spat, scrambling to his feet. "You think your tricks will save you? This is my throne?" Lucian advanced, his voice like steel. "That throne belongs to the rightful heir, me. You have poisoned this kingdom with your greed and cruelty, and it ends now." Cedric's lip curled, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. His fingers twitched toward the hidden dagger at his belt, but before he could even think to strike, Seraphina lifted a single hand. The dagger wrenched itself from his grasp and spun through the air, landing at Lucian's feet. The usurper paled, knowing there was nowhere left to run. Seraphina's voice, calm and lethal, filled the chamber. "The reign of the unworthy is over." Lucian stepped onto the dais, his voice unwavering. "This throne is not yours to claim, Cedric. You have let the kingdom fall into ruin, but no longer. The people deserve better, and I will see justice done." With nowhere to run, Cedric's reign came to an end that very night. The rightful heir had returned. As Lucian sat upon the throne, feeling the weight of his ancestors upon his shoulders, Seraphina approached him with a knowing smile. "You have reclaimed what is yours, but a king cannot rule alone. A strong kingdom requires reform, and a strong king requires a queen." Lucian exhaled, a small smile playing at his lips. "I have already found her, mother." Seraphina's brows lifted slightly, but there was warmth in her eyes. "Oh? And what is she like? Tell me, is she a warrior? A noble woman? Does she possess magic?" Lucian chuckled, shaking his head. "She is none of those things, and yet she is stronger than any warrior, wiser than any noble, and her kindness is more powerful than magic. She is a healer, a woman of the people." Seraphina smirked, crossing her arms. "A healer? Interesting. And she has tamed you, my son." "Tamed me? Hardly. She challenges me, makes me see the world as it is, and she is unafraid to speak her mind. She has no desire for power, and that is precisely why she will make the perfect queen." Seraphina sighed dramatically. "Well, I suppose I should meet this remarkable woman who has captured my son's heart. Let us bring her home." With the throne secured and order beginning to be restored, Lucian and Seraphina rode through the kingdom with their newly appointed royal guard, men of honor and loyalty, hand-picked by Lucian himself. They traveled to the outskirts where Evelyn continued her work tending to the sick and wounded, unaware of the changes that had unfolded. When they arrived, Evelyn stepped forward cautiously, confusion flickering in her eyes as she beheld the armor-clad soldiers and the regal presence of Lucian and his mother. Her family and neighbors gathered behind her, murmuring in hushed voices, their eyes filled with both awe and apprehension. "Lucian?" she whispered, her voice uncertain, searching his face for answers. He dismounted and strode toward her, his heart pounding. "Evelyn," he breathed, taking her hands in his. "I told you I would come back for you." Her eyes widened as realization dawned, flicking between him and Seraphina, then to the soldiers behind them. You're the king?" Lucian nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "I am now, and I want you by my side, not as a servant of the people, but as their queen. Will you rule with me?" Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her hand clutching his tighter. "You're serious?" "Lucian, I don't belong in a palace. I'm just a healer. I don't know how to be a queen." Seraphina stepped forward, her gaze gentle. "You are more than a healer, child. You have already done more for this kingdom than most nobles ever will. You are strong, and you love my son." "That is enough." Eveline's lips parted, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never dreamed of such a life. But as she looked into Lucian's eyes, so full of warmth and promise, she knew her answer. "Yes, Lucian. Always." A collective gasp of joy rippled through the villagers, and before she could say another word, Lucian pulled her into his arms. She felt the warmth of his embrace, his heart pounding against hers, steady and strong. Her breath hitched as his fingers traced her jawline, tilting her face toward his. The world around them faded, the murmurs of the villagers a distant hum as he leaned in. Their lips met, soft at first, a tentative whisper of a promise long overdue. Then the kiss deepened, slow and lingering, as if time itself had paused to witness their union. Evelyn melted against him, the heat of his touch sending shivers through her as her hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as if afraid to let go. As they parted, her eyes fluttered open, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "I still can't believe this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're the king, Lucian." He pressed his forehead to hers, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "I was always yours first, Evelyn. The crown means nothing without you by my side." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, radiant and full of love. "Then let's go home, my king." Hand in hand, they turned toward their awaiting future, the kingdom reborn in love and hope.